It was a calm afternoon in the quiet town of Riverdale, where time seemed to move slower than anywhere else. The small convenience store on Main Street had seen countless faces over the years, locals who stopped by for their daily groceries, travelers passing through, and the occasional teenager hunting for snacks. Today, however, an unassuming elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson entered the store, unknowingly about to become the center of a story no one would forget. Mrs. Thompson was no stranger to the town. Her presence was as familiar as the ringing of the church bells on Sunday mornings. She was small in stature, with silver hair neatly pinned back and a slightly stooped posture that spoke of a life filled with hard work. Her clothes were plain but clean, a faded blue cardigan draped over her thin frame. In her hands, she clutched a worn handbag that had seen better days, the leather cracked and softened from years of use. She stepped through the glass door of the store with measured movements, the faint jingle of the bell overhead announcing her arrival. Each step she took was slow and deliberate, as though her frail legs were carefully calculating every inch of ground they covered. Her face, lined with the wrinkles of time, carried a warmth that even strangers could feel. It was the kind of face that told 1,000 stories without a word spoken, of challenges faced, of kindness given, and of quiet strength that endured. Behind the counter stood the shopkeeper, a middle-aged man with a sour expression. His name was Joe, though most people in town referred to him simply as the guy at the store. Joe had owned the shop for years, but his demeanor had grown increasingly irritable over time. He barely looked up from the magazine he was flipping through as Mrs. Thompson entered, his brow furrowing in annoyance. Mrs. Thompson approached the counter slowly, her shoes making a soft shuffling sound against the tiled floor. She offered a small, polite smile to Joe, but he didn't respond. Instead, he sighed loudly, the sound exaggerated enough to let her know he was already frustrated. "What now, Mrs. T?" he said without looking up. "You're not here to waste time with those coupons again, are you?" A faint blush crept onto Mrs. Thompson's cheeks, but her smile didn't waver. "Good afternoon, Joe," she said softly, her voice trembling just a little. "I just need to pick up a few things, that's all." Joe finally looked up, his eyes scanning her with thinly veiled impatience. "Well, hurry it up, then," he muttered, his tone sharp. "I've got other customers to deal with." Mrs. Thompson nodded quickly, fumbling with her handbag as she tried to pull out a small, folded list. Behind her, the line had begun to form. First was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a hoodie, standing quietly with his hands in his pockets. His hood was pulled up, shadowing his face, but something about him seemed out of place. While others shuffled impatiently or tapped their feet, he remained still, casually scrolling through his phone. His sneakers, a pristine pair of rare, limited edition Nikes, might have caught someone's eye if they'd bothered to notice. Mrs. Thompson didn't notice the line behind her at first. Her trembling fingers finally managed to retrieve the list, which was written in shaky handwriting on a scrap of yellowed paper. As she adjusted her glasses to read it, Joe crossed his arms, making no effort to hide his irritation. "Hurry up, will ya?" he barked, glancing at the clock on the wall. "You're holding up the line." Mrs. Thompson glanced back over her shoulder, her kind eyes widening slightly when she saw the people waiting behind her. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said quickly, her voice filled with genuine concern. She shuffled to the side, letting the next customer approach the counter. The man in the hoodie took a step forward but didn't say a word. Instead, he watched the interaction quietly, his hands still tucked into his pockets. The faintest of smiles played on his lips, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. His eyes, sharp and observant, flicked between Mrs. Thompson and Joe, taking in every detail. Joe barely glanced at the man in the hoodie. His focus was back on Mrs. Thompson, who had stepped to the side and was now looking through the shelves, her list clutched tightly in her hand. She moved carefully, pausing every few moments as though searching for something she couldn't find. "Sheesh, Joe muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Why does she even bother coming here if she can't keep up? Always holding everyone up. His words weren't loud enough for Mrs. Thompson to hear, but the man in the hoodie caught them. His expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, disapproval, perhaps, or maybe something deeper. Mrs. Thompson finally found what she was looking for, a small carton of milk. She picked it up carefully, examining the price tag before adding it to her basket. Her next stop was the bread aisle, where she hesitated for a long moment before selecting the cheapest loaf. Her movements were slow but deliberate, each item chosen with care and precision. To anyone watching, it was clear she was counting every penny in her head. Joe's patience was wearing thin. He leaned over the counter, his foot tapping against the floor. "Are you done yet, Mrs. T?" he called out, his tone sharp and impatient. "Some of us have other things to do today." Mrs. Thompson turned to look at him, her expression apologetic. "Almost," she said softly. "Just one more thing." Behind her, the man in the hoodie shifted his weight slightly, still silent but watching everything unfold. His sneakers made no sound as he moved, but their pristine white contrasted sharply with the dull tile floor. Another person in line, a young woman with a baby in her arms, glanced at him curiously but didn't say anything. Mrs. Thompson finally approached the counter again, her basket containing only a few items, the carton of milk, the loaf of bread, and a small jar of jam. She set them down gently, her hands trembling slightly. "That's everything," she said with a faint smile. Joe rang up the items quickly, barely looking at her. "That'll be $8.47, he said flatly. Mrs. Thompson opened her handbag, pulling out a small coin purse. She counted the coins carefully, her fingers moving slowly as she tried to add them up. After a moment, she paused, her brow furrowing in concern. "Oh dear," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I think I'm a little short." Joe sighed loudly, crossing his arms. "Seriously? Look, if you don't have the money, you can't take the stuff. Simple as that." Mrs. Thompson looked up at him, her eyes filled with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly. "Maybe I can put the jam back." Before she could finish, the man in the hoodie stepped forward. His voice was calm but firm as he spoke. "Why don't you let her finish?" Joe squinted at the man in the hoodie, clearly irritated. "And who are you, exactly?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Her lawyer or something?" The man didn't react to the hostility. His posture was relaxed, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his hoodie. When he spoke again, his tone was steady and calm. "Just someone who doesn't think people should be treated like that." Joe let out a short, mocking laugh. "Oh, please. Don't start preaching at me. You don't know what it's like running a business like this. Everyone's got their sob story, and I can't give handouts to everyone who walks through that door." Mrs. Thompson looked between the two men, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Oh, it's okay," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I'll just put this back." She reached for the jar of jam, her frail hands shaking as she picked it up. The man in the hoodie stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't need to do that," he said softly. Then, turning to Joe, he added, "Ring it all up. I'll cover it." Joe frowned, clearly annoyed. "Look, buddy, I don't know what your deal is, but—" "It's not up for debate," the man interrupted, his voice firm now. His casual demeanor shifted slightly, a quiet authority creeping into his tone. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black wallet. "How much does she owe?" Joe hesitated, glancing between the man and Mrs. Thompson. He seemed to realize he wasn't going to win this argument. With a reluctant sigh, he muttered, "$8.47. The man handed Joe a crisp $20 bill. "Keep the change," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Mrs. Thompson looked up at him, her eyes wide with gratitude. "Oh, thank you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "You didn't have to do that." "It's no trouble," the man said with a small smile. "You shouldn't have to go without the things you need." She clutched her handbag tightly, her fingers trembling. "You're very kind. Not many people would step in like that." The man shrugged, slipping his wallet back into his pocket. "Kindness doesn't cost much. And honestly, more people should speak up when they see something wrong." Joe, meanwhile, was visibly irritated. He slammed the cash register shut and handed Mrs. Thompson her change and receipt without so much as a word. "There. Done. Happy now," he muttered, glaring at the man in the hoodie. The man didn't respond to Joe's hostility. Instead, he turned back to Mrs. Thompson, who was carefully placing her items into a reusable cloth bag. "Do you need help carrying that?" he asked. Mrs. Thompson smiled, though her cheeks were still flushed with embarrassment. "Oh, no, dear. I can manage. You've already done so much for me." The man nodded but didn't move away. He seemed to be watching her carefully, as if ensuring she wouldn't have any trouble getting home. Joe, meanwhile, couldn't hold back his irritation any longer. "You know," he said loudly, addressing the man in the hoodie, "if you're so eager to throw your money around, maybe you should do it somewhere else. I've got a business to run here, and I don't need people like you making things harder." The man turned his head slightly, his sharp eyes locking onto Joe. For a moment, the air in the room seemed to shift. It wasn't threatening, exactly, but there was an unmistakable intensity in his gaze. "People like me," he repeated, his voice calm but with a hint of steel. Joe faltered, realizing he might have overstepped. "I mean, look, whatever. Just don't make a habit of it, okay? I've got enough freeloaders around here as it is." Mrs. Thompson looked down at the floor, her shoulders hunching slightly as if trying to make herself smaller. The man in the hoodie, however, didn't seem fazed. He took a small step closer to the counter, his voice low but firm. "You might want to think about how you talk to people. Especially your customers." Joe rolled his eyes, muttering something under his breath that no one could quite make out. The tension in the room was palpable, and the other customers in line were watching the interaction with quiet curiosity. The man turned back to Mrs. Thompson, his demeanor softening immediately. "Do you live nearby?" he asked gently. She nodded. "Just a few blocks away. It's not far. Let me walk you home," he offered. "I don't mind." "Oh, that's very kind of you," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice warm but hesitant. "But really, I don't want to trouble you." "It's no trouble at all," the man assured her. He picked up her bag, holding it as if it weighed nothing. "Besides, it's always good to have company, right?" Mrs. Thompson hesitated for a moment, then nodded with a small smile. "Well, if you insist." As the two of them headed for the door, Joe called out behind them. "Yeah, you two have a great day or whatever," he said sarcastically. "Don't forget to come back next time you're short on cash." The man paused, his hand on the door handle. He turned back to look at Joe, his expression unreadable. "You really don't get it, do you?" he said quietly. Joe opened his mouth to respond, but the man didn't wait for an answer. He pushed the door open, holding it for Mrs. Thompson as she stepped outside. The shop bell jingled faintly as the door swung shut behind Mrs. Thompson. She shuffled forward, her worn shoes scuffing lightly against the floor. Joe, the shopkeeper, sat behind the counter, leaning back in his chair with a magazine spread open in front of him. His expression barely shifted as he glanced up, but his frown deepened the moment he saw who had walked in. "What now, Mrs. T?" he muttered, loud enough for everyone in the small shop to hear. His tone was sharp, dismissive, and tinged with impatience. He didn't bother to hide his annoyance. "You're not here to use those coupons again, are you?" Mrs. Thompson stopped in her tracks, clutching her handbag tightly. A faint flush crept up her cheeks, but she kept her composure. "Good afternoon, Joe," she said softly, her voice steady despite the clear tension. "I just needed a few things, that's all." Joe rolled his eyes and leaned back even further in his chair, letting it creak under his weight. "Uh-huh," he said, his words dripping with sarcasm. He snapped his magazine shut with a loud slap, the sound making Mrs. Thompson flinch slightly. "Well, let's not waste everyone's time, okay? You're holding up the line." There wasn't much of a line yet, just one or two people behind her, but Joe's words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Mrs. Thompson hesitated, her trembling fingers reaching into her bag as she tried to retrieve the small, folded list she had prepared. Her movements were slow and deliberate, each one seeming to take far more effort than it should. The man in the hoodie, who had been standing silently near the back of the store, shifted his weight slightly. He was tall, with a hood pulled up that cast a shadow over his face. In one hand, he held a phone, casually scrolling as though he wasn't paying attention to the scene unfolding in front of him. But the faint narrowing of his eyes suggested otherwise. Mrs. Thompson finally managed to pull the list from her bag, holding it up with shaky hands. She adjusted her glasses and squinted at the paper, her expression one of quiet determination. "I'll be quick," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just need a loaf of bread, some milk, and," she trailed off, her eyes scanning the list. Joe let out an exaggerated sigh, crossing his arms over his chest. "Bread and milk, huh? Let me guess you've got another one of those buy one get one free coupons you want to argue about." His words were laced with disdain, and the corners of his mouth curled into a smirk. "No, no," Mrs. Thompson said quickly, shaking her head. "I don't have any coupons today. I promise." Joe snorted. "Good. Last time, you spent 20 minutes trying to explain why your coupon should have worked. I don't have time for that nonsense today." He gestured toward the shelves with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Go on, then. Get what you need and make it quick." Mrs. Thompson nodded and turned toward the aisles, her small frame moving even slower now as if the weight of Joe's words had added to her already heavy steps. Behind her, the two people in line exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity and impatience. The man in the hoodie, however, remained still, his sharp gaze following Mrs. Thompson as she made her way toward the bread section. The store was quiet except for the faint rustle of Mrs. Thompson's footsteps and the occasional creak of a shelf as she reached for an item. She picked up a loaf of bread, carefully examining the price tag before adding it to her basket. Her hands trembled slightly as she moved, but her expression remained calm and focused. Joe watched her from behind the counter, his frown deepening with every passing second. He tapped his fingers against the counter, the rhythmic sound echoing in the small space. "Any day now, Mrs. T," he called out, his voice laced with impatience. "Some of us have other things to do." Mrs. Thompson glanced back over her shoulder, her cheeks flushing once more. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I'll be as quick as I can." Yeah, Joe muttered under his breath. He picked up his magazine again, flipping through the pages with an air of irritation. As Mrs. Thompson reached for a small carton of milk, her fingers brushed against another carton, causing it to wobble precariously on the shelf. She quickly steadied it, her movements careful and deliberate. The man in the hoodie took a small step closer, his attention still fixed on her. His sneakers, pristine and expensive looking, made no sound on the tiled floor. By the time Mrs. Thompson returned to the counter, her basket held only 3 items, the loaf of bread, the carton of milk, and a small jar of jam. She set them down gently, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her coin purse. Joe glanced at the items and raised an eyebrow. "That it?" he asked, his tone flat and unimpressed. Mrs. Thompson nodded. "Yes, that's everything." Joe scanned the items quickly, the beeping of the register breaking the silence. "That'll be $8.47, he said, holding out his hand for the money. Mrs. Thompson opened her coin purse, carefully counting out the coins. Her fingers moved slowly, her brow furrowed in concentration. After a moment, she paused, her expression falling. "Oh dear," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I think I'm a little short." Joe let out another loud sigh, crossing his arms once more. "Seriously," he said, his voice rising. "Look, lady, if you don't have the money, you can't take the stuff. Simple as that." Mrs. Thompson looked up at him, her eyes filled with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly. "Maybe I can put the jam back." Before she could finish, the man in the hoodie stepped forward. His movements were smooth and deliberate, and for the first time, he spoke. His voice was calm, but there was a quiet authority in his tone. "Why don't you let her finish?" Joe turned to him, his eyebrows shooting up in surprise. "Excuse me," he said, his tone defensive. "And who are you, exactly?" The man didn't answer right away. He slipped his phone into his pocket and took another step closer, his presence suddenly impossible to ignore. "Someone who thinks you should treat your customers with a little more respect," he said simply. Joe scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "Oh, great. Another hero. Look, pal, if you want to play Good Samaritan, go ahead and pay for her stuff. Otherwise, mind your own business." The man's gaze didn't waver. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek black wallet. "How much does she owe?" Joe hesitated, caught off guard by the man's confidence. $8.47, he muttered. The man handed him a crisp $20 bill. "Keep the change," he said, his tone firm but calm. Mrs. Thompson looked up at him, her eyes wide with gratitude. "Oh, thank you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "You didn't have to do that." "It's no trouble," the man said, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "You shouldn't have to go without the things you need." Joe muttered something under his breath as he handed Mrs. Thompson her bag. The tension in the air was palpable, but the man in the hoodie remained calm, his sharp eyes briefly locking with Joe's before he turned to help Mrs. Thompson with her bag. Mrs. Thompson clutched her bag of groceries, her frail hands trembling slightly. "Thank you, young man," she said softly, her voice laced with gratitude. "It's been a difficult month, you've helped more than you know." The man in the hoodie nodded, his face mostly hidden but his demeanor kind. "Don't mention it," he said simply. His tone was casual, but there was a firmness to it that hinted at a deeper resolve. Joe, the shopkeeper, scoffed loudly. "Seriously? We're just letting anybody walk in here and play saint now." His words were sharp, meant to sting, but the man in the hoodie didn't flinch. Instead, he turned his gaze to Joe, calm but piercing, as though he was evaluating him in a way the shopkeeper wasn't used to. "Kindness isn't something that costs you, you know," the man said, his voice steady. Joe bristled, the redness creeping up his neck betraying his irritation. "Kindness doesn't pay the bills, pal. And if you're so interested in charity cases, maybe you should open your own store." Mrs. Thompson, sensing the growing tension, murmured, "Please, let's not argue. I'll be on my way, thank you again." She offered the man a weak smile before turning toward the door, her step slow and careful. As the bell jingled faintly behind her, Joe muttered under his breath, "People like that always dragging their sob stories in here. It's pathetic." The man in the hoodie turned back to Joe, his posture relaxed but his voice carrying an edge now. People like that? He asked, his tone challenging. Joe looked up, narrowing his eyes. Yeah, people like that. Always expecting handouts, wasting everyone's time with their little "oh, I'm short a few cents" routine. Some of us are running a business here, not a charity. The man didn't reply immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, placing both hands on the counter. The movement wasn't aggressive, but it commanded attention. You know, maybe she wasn't asking for charity, he said evenly. Maybe she just needed a little understanding. But I guess that's harder to come by these days. Joe crossed his arms defensively, leaning back in his chair. Look, buddy, I don't know who you think you are, but this is my store. I'll run it how I see fit. If you don't like it, there's the door. A faint smile tugged at the corner of the man's mouth, though it didn't reach his eyes. Oh, I see. It's your store, so that means you get to treat people however you want. That's quite the policy. Joe's face flushed deeper, the color rising to his cheeks. What's it to you, anyway? You don't know her, and you sure as hell don't know me. The man tilted his head slightly, as though considering Joe's words. Then, with deliberate calm, he said, No, I don't know you. But I've been in enough places like this to know the type. His words were measured, but there was a weight to them that made the air in the small shop feel heavier. The other customers in line, who had been pretending not to listen, exchanged glances. One of them, a younger woman with a toddler in tow, shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure whether to step in or remain silent. Joe, perhaps sensing he was losing the upper hand, straightened in his chair. Look, pal, I don't need a lecture on how to run my business. If you're done playing hero, maybe you should move along. I've got real customers to deal with. The man in the hoodie remained still for a moment, his gaze fixed on Joe. Then he reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek black wallet once again. Without breaking eye contact, he placed another bill on the counter. That's for the next person who comes in and can't afford what they need, he said quietly. Maybe it'll remind you what this place is supposed to be about. Joe stared at the bill, his jaw tightening. For a moment, he seemed unsure of how to respond. Then he snorted, a bitter laugh escaping him. Big spender, huh? You think waving some cash around makes you better than everyone else? The man's calm demeanor didn't waver. It's not about being better, he said simply. It's about being decent. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the store's overhead lights. Finally, the man turned away, his movements unhurried. He walked toward the door, the hood of his sweatshirt still obscuring most of his face. As he reached the exit, he paused, his hand on the handle. Without looking back, he added, and by the way, you might want to rethink how you treat people. You never know who's watching. With that, he pushed the door open and stepped outside, the bell jingling softly in his wake. Joe sat frozen behind the counter, his expression a mix of irritation and unease. One of the customers in line, the young woman with the toddler, cleared her throat. You know, she said hesitantly, he's right. The way you treated that lady earlier, it wasn't okay. Joe's head snapped toward her, his glare sharp. Oh, great. Another critic. You people don't know the first thing about running a business. The woman flinched but held her ground. Maybe not, she said softly, but I know what kindness looks like. And that wasn't it? Mrs. Thompson hesitated near the door, clutching her bag tightly. Her frail figure seemed smaller now, as though the weight of the shopkeeper's harsh words had diminished her presence. The other customers shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they hadn't seen anything. Joe, the shopkeeper, shook his head and leaned back against the counter, his disdain clear. People like her need to stop wasting time, he muttered, not bothering to lower his voice. The man in the hoodie, still standing in line, finally took a step forward. He spoke calmly, but there was a firm edge to his voice. "Why don't you let her finish what she was trying to say?" Joe glanced up, his eyes narrowing as he sized up the man. He leaned forward slightly, his irritation growing. "And who exactly are you? Some kind of do-gooder? This is my store. I don't need advice from someone who doesn't even look like they're buying anything." The man's faint smile didn't waver. He casually slipped his phone into his pocket and crossed his arms, his posture relaxed but purposeful. "Just someone who's curious," he replied smoothly. "Do you always treat your customers like this?" Joe let out a sharp laugh, the sound harsh in the tense silence of the shop. "Customers? She's not a customer, she's a charity case. And if you're so concerned, why don't you pay for her next time? Or better yet, open your own store and do things your way." A few murmurs rippled through the line. One or two customers exchanged glances, unsure whether to side with Joe or stay silent. The man in the hoodie didn't seem fazed. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as though studying Joe, his gaze unwavering. "I see," the man said after a moment. "So, you're saying kindness is bad for business? Interesting philosophy." Joe's face darkened, the flush creeping up his neck. "Listen, I don't have time for lectures. If you're not buying anything, you can leave." The man's faint smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Don't worry. I'm not going anywhere just yet." The shop fell silent again, the tension thick in the air. Even the customers who had been scrolling through their phones or looking at the displays were now watching the exchange closely. There was something about the man, his calm confidence, the way he seemed unaffected by Joe's hostility, that made it hard to look away. Mrs. Thompson, who had paused near the door, turned back hesitantly. Her voice was soft, but it carried through the quiet store. "Please, don't argue over me. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Joe rolled his eyes dramatically. "See? Even she knows she's being a nuisance." Before anyone could respond, the man in the hoodie raised a hand, silencing the shopkeeper with a simple gesture. "You don't have to apologize, ma'am," he said gently. "You're not the problem here." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Mrs. Thompson blink back tears. She nodded quietly, her hands trembling as she adjusted her grip on her bag. Joe, however, was not impressed. He leaned back on his stool, crossing his arms with a smirk. "You think you're a hero, huh? Coming in here, telling me how to do my job? Newsflash, I don't need saving, and neither does she." The man's smile faded slightly, replaced by a more serious expression. "It's not about being a hero," he said evenly. "It's about basic respect. Something this place seems to be lacking." Joe scoffed again, but his smirk faltered ever so slightly. The man's calm demeanor was starting to unnerve him, though he would never admit it. "Respect doesn't pay the bills," Joe shot back. "Maybe you should stick to whatever it is you do and leave the business stuff to me." "Fair enough," the man said, nodding slightly. "But here's the thing, respect has a way of coming back around. So does disrespect." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You might want to think about which one you're putting out into the world." The other customers were now openly watching, some with quiet approval, others with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. One woman near the back, holding a small child, murmured softly to her friend, "Who is this guy?" Joe, determined to reclaim control of the situation, barked out a laugh. "You think you're some kind of philosopher or something? Spare me the life lessons, pal." The man's faint smile returned. "Not a philosopher," he said simply. "Just someone who's been around long enough to know how these things work." As he spoke, a subtle detail caught the eye of one of the customers, a small logo embroidered on the edge of his hoodie. It was discreet, almost unnoticeable, but it looked familiar. The customer squinted, trying to place where they'd seen it before. Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson lingered near the door, her expression a mix of gratitude and concern. She glanced at the man in the hoodie, as though sensing there was more to him than met the eye. But she didn't say anything, instead gripping her bag tighter and waiting to see what would happen next. Joe, still irritated but starting to feel the weight of the growing attention, leaned forward. "Look, buddy, if you've got something to say, just say it. Otherwise, I've got work to do." The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone again. For a brief moment, the screen lit up, and those closest to him caught a glimpse of what looked like an impressive number of notifications. He tapped the screen a couple of times before slipping it back into his pocket. Then he looked up, meeting Joe's gaze directly. "Oh, I'll say what I need to say," he replied calmly. "But not yet. Let's give it a minute." Joe frowned, confused. "What's that supposed to mean?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back slightly, his posture still relaxed but his presence commanding. The customers in line leaned closer, their curiosity growing with each passing moment. The air in the shop grew thick with tension, the kind that made everyone hyper-aware of their surroundings. People shuffled uneasily in line, exchanging looks as the man in the hoodie stood his ground. Joe, the shopkeeper, scowled, his bravado faltering ever so slightly under the weight of the attention. "Listen," Joe said, his tone sharp and defensive. "I don't have time for whatever game you're playing. If you're not here to buy something, you're wasting my time." The man in the hoodie gave a small shrug. "Time's valuable, sure. But so is reputation." He glanced around the store, his eyes sweeping over the onlookers who were now openly watching. "And from where I'm standing, yours isn't looking too great." Joe's jaw tightened, his irritation bubbling over. "My reputation? I've been running this place for 20 years. I know what I'm doing. I don't need lectures from some punk in a hoodie." The man's faint smile returned, but this time there was a flicker of something else in his expression, an almost imperceptible amusement, as though he knew something Joe didn't. 20 years, huh? Impressive. But I wonder how long it'll last if word gets out about how you treat your customers." Joe's face darkened. "You threatening me now?" "Not a threat," the man replied, his tone calm and measured. "Just an observation." The murmurs among the customers grew louder. A middle-aged man near the back of the line crossed his arms and muttered, "He's got a point, though." A young woman nodded in agreement, while others simply watched, their curiosity piqued. Joe's gaze darted toward the murmuring crowd, his irritation giving way to unease. "All right, that's enough," he snapped. "Everyone's got opinions, huh? Well, last I checked, I'm the one paying the bills around here, not you lot." The man in the hoodie stepped forward again, his movements deliberate but unthreatening. "And last I checked," he said, his voice steady, "customers are the reason those bills get paid." For a moment, Joe was silent, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. He opened his mouth to respond but was interrupted by the jingle of the door opening behind him. A teenage employee stepped in, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. She froze, clutching a box of supplies, clearly unsure whether to speak. The man in the hoodie turned slightly, acknowledging her presence with a brief nod before refocusing on Joe. "You've got people working for you," he said, his voice quieter now, almost conversational. "People relying on you. Ever think about the example you're setting?" Joe's scowl deepened, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The teenager hovered near the door, looking between Joe and the man, her discomfort palpable. Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson had taken a step back into the store, watching the exchange unfold with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. She clutched her bag tightly, her frail hands trembling slightly. "Please," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the tension. "I don't want to cause trouble." The man turned to her, his expression softening. "You're not causing trouble, ma'am," he said gently. "You deserve to be treated with respect, just like anyone else." Mrs. Thompson nodded hesitantly, her cheeks flushing. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice trembling with emotion. Joe, sensing the shift in the room, forced a harsh laugh. "Oh, come on. Respect this, respect that. What are you, a motivational speaker now?" The man in the hoodie didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket again, pulling out his phone. This time, he held it up briefly, angling it so the screen was partially visible to those closest to him. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd as a few people recognized the notifications flooding his screen. One man near the front of the line squinted, his eyes widening in recognition. "Wait a second," he muttered under his breath, nudging the person next to him. "Is that?" The man in the hoodie lowered the phone and tucked it back into his pocket, his expression unreadable. "Let's just say," he began, his voice calm but carrying a quiet authority, "I've seen how people like you run things before. It usually doesn't end well." Joe's bravado faltered, his face flushing a deep red. "What's that supposed to mean?" he snapped. "You don't know a damn thing about me." The man's gaze didn't waver. "I know enough," he said simply. "I know that respect isn't just about being polite. It's about how you treat people when no one's looking or when you think no one important is." The weight of his words hung in the air, pressing down on the room. The customers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier murmurs replaced by a heavy silence. Even Joe seemed momentarily at a loss for words, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to form a retort. The teenager near the door finally spoke, her voice tentative but clear. Mr. Joe? Maybe he's right. I mean, sometimes it's hard for customers to come back when," she trailed off, her cheeks turning pink as Joe's glare snapped toward her. "What are you talking about?" he barked. "You're siding with this guy now?" The girl flinched but held her ground, her voice trembling slightly. "I just think, sometimes a little kindness goes a long way." The man in the hoodie gave her a small nod, his expression one of quiet approval. "Smart kid," he said softly, before turning back to Joe. "Maybe you should listen to her." Joe's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his frustration evident. "All right, that's enough," he snapped. "I've had just about enough of your holier-than-thou attitude. You don't get to waltz in here and tell me how to run my store." The man's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, something almost imperceptible but undeniably commanding. "Maybe not," he said evenly. "But I can tell you this, the way you treat people has a way of catching up to you. And when it does, it's not pretty." Joe opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the man reached into his pocket once more. This time, he pulled out a folded piece of paper and placed it on the counter. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the door, the bell jingling softly as he stepped outside. The customers stared after him, their curiosity at its peak. One woman near the counter leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the paper. "What's that?" she whispered. Joe, still fuming, snatched up the paper and unfolded it. His eyes scanned the text, his expression shifting from irritation to confusion, and then to something resembling shock. "What does it say?" someone in line asked. Joe didn't answer. He simply stood there, frozen, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at the paper. Whatever it was, it had shaken him to his core. Mrs. Thompson paused mid-step, her frail hand gripping the edge of a nearby shelf for balance. Her eyes, wide with surprise, darted between the man in the hoodie and the growing crowd of murmuring customers. She looked confused, unsure of what was unfolding, yet something about the man's voice stopped her from leaving. The man slowly pulled his hood down, revealing his face. His dark brown hair fell slightly across his forehead as his calm, assured expression met the crowd's curious gazes. A collective gasp echoed through the room. "That's him. Oh my gosh, it's him," a teenage boy near the back of the store exclaimed, his phone now recording the scene. "No way," muttered another woman, clutching her shopping bag tightly. That's MrBeast." Joe, the shopkeeper, froze in place. His face turned ashen, his hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly his knuckles turned white. The man now unmistakably recognized as MrBeast, the internet icon known for his generosity and jaw-dropping acts of kindness, stepped closer to Mrs. Thompson. He gave her a reassuring smile. "Ma'am," he said gently, his tone warm and respectful, "don't leave just yet. We're going to make things right." Mrs. Thompson blinked, her lips trembling as she tried to process the situation. I don't understand," she said softly, glancing back toward the line of stunned customers. Joe's voice, shaky and defensive, finally broke the silence. "Is this some kind of prank? What are you even doing here?" MrBeast turned to Joe, his calm demeanor never wavering. "I was just passing through, grabbing a snack. But then I saw how you treated her." He nodded toward Mrs. Thompson, his gaze sharp. "And I couldn't just stand by and watch." Joe sputtered, his earlier arrogance crumbling under the weight of the stares and whispers surrounding him. I didn't know. I didn't realize." "Didn't realize what?" MrBeast asked, his voice firm but not angry. "That she's a person? That everyone deserves kindness and respect, no matter who they are or how much money they have." Joe's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The weight of the moment and the crowd's judgmental eyes left him speechless. Meanwhile, more people in the line had pulled out their phones, recording the confrontation. MrBeast glanced briefly at the phones but remained focused on Joe. "You've been running this store for 20 years, right?" Joe nodded stiffly, his shoulders slumping. "And in all those years," MrBeast continued, his voice carrying authority, "have you ever thought about the impact you have on the people who walk through that door?" Joe's face flushed. He tried to muster some semblance of pride, but it was clear his confidence was fading fast. I'm just trying to make a living." "And so is she," MrBeast said, gesturing toward Mrs. Thompson. "But instead of helping her, you chose to humiliate her." The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner. Every customer, every phone camera, was fixed on the unfolding drama. Finally, MrBeast took a deep breath and turned back to Mrs. Thompson. "Ma'am, could you tell me what you were trying to buy?" Mrs. Thompson hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just some bread and milk. I didn't have enough for both." MrBeast's expression softened. "That's all?" She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I was going to put the bread back." The room seemed to exhale collectively, the simplicity of her request striking a chord with everyone present. MrBeast reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black wallet. He flipped it open, pulling out a thick stack of bills. Without hesitation, he handed it to Mrs. Thompson. "Here," he said, pressing the money into her hands. "This is for your groceries. For the whole month, if you need it." Mrs. Thompson gasped, her hands trembling as she held the money. "Oh, I can't accept this. It's too much." "Yes, you can," MrBeast replied, his voice kind but firm. "You deserve it." Tears streamed down Mrs. Thompson's face as she clutched the money to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you so much." The crowd erupted into murmurs of awe and admiration, the tension in the room transforming into an atmosphere of warmth and gratitude. But MrBeast wasn't finished. He turned back to Joe, his expression now serious. "As for you," he began, his voice steady but sharp, This isn't just about her. It's about how you treat everyone who comes into the store. Joe fidgeted nervously, his earlier bravado completely gone. I didn't mean to. You didn't mean to what? MrBeast interrupted. To treat her like she didn't matter? To dismiss her like she wasn't worth your time. Joe's eyes darted to the recording phones, panic flickering across his face. I was having a bad day. It's not like this all the time. MrBeast raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. Bad days don't excuse bad behavior. The crowd nodded in agreement, a few people even murmuring, that's right, and he's got a point. Then, in a move that caught everyone off guard, MrBeast reached into his pocket again. This time, he pulled out a checkbook. He scribbled something quickly, tore out the check, and placed it on the counter. Joe hesitated before picking it up. His eyes widened as he read the number. Is this real? He asked, his voice shaking. It is, MrBeast said. It's enough to cover your bills for the next 6 months. But there's a condition. Joe looked up, confused. A condition? You start treating every customer with respect, MrBeast said firmly. No exceptions. And if I hear otherwise, I'll personally make sure everyone knows how you run your business. Joe swallowed hard, his hand clutching the check like a lifeline. I understand. Good, MrBeast said, his tone softening slightly. Because every person who walks through that door deserves to be treated with dignity. Whether they're rich or poor, young or old, it doesn't matter. Got it? Joe nodded quickly, his earlier arrogance now replaced with humility. Yes. I got it. Satisfied, MrBeast turned back to Mrs. Thompson. And as for you, ma'am, if you ever need anything at all, you let me know, okay? Mrs. Thompson smiled through her tears, nodding. I will. Thank you. Thank you so much. With that, MrBeast gave her a warm smile, then turned and walked toward the door. The crowd parted to let him through, their murmurs now filled with admiration and gratitude. As the door jingled shut behind him, the store remained quiet for a moment, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. Then, one by one, the customers began to clap, their applause filling the room. Mrs. Thompson stood at the counter, still clutching the money, her face a mixture of disbelief and joy. Joe, for his part, stared at the check in his hands, the lesson clear and unforgettable. Outside, MrBeast disappeared into the bustling street, leaving behind a story that no one in the store would ever forget. As the door swung shut behind MrBeast, the store remained silent for a moment longer. The applause slowly died down, but the impact of what had just happened lingered heavily in the air. Mrs. Thompson, still clutching the stack of bills, turned to face the line of customers. Her weathered face was streaked with tears, but her smile shone through. She opened her mouth to speak, but her emotions overwhelmed her, and she simply nodded gratefully at the onlookers. The teenage boy who had been recording stepped forward, his phone still in hand. Mrs. Thompson, he said hesitantly, his voice cracking slightly with emotion, you're, like, a hero now. People need to hear your story. She shook her head, her humility shining through. Oh, I'm no hero, dear. Just an old woman trying to get by. But that's just it, the boy exclaimed. You were kind and patient even when, his eyes flicked to Joe, whose head was bowed in a mixture of shame and reflection. Even when people weren't kind to you. Joe looked up at the boy's words, and his face flushed red. Clearing his throat, he finally found the courage to speak. Mrs. Thompson, he began, his voice uneven, I'm sorry. For how I treated you today. For how I've treated you every other time. It wasn't right. Mrs. Thompson turned to him, her expression softening. She studied his face for a moment, as if searching for sincerity. Finally, she nodded. Thank you, Joe. Apology accepted. Her grace only deepened the impression she had left on everyone in the store. A middle-aged woman near the back of the line wiped her eyes with a tissue and muttered, "That's what true kindness looks like." Joe, still visibly shaken, straightened his posture and took a deep breath. "I need to do better," he admitted, his voice stronger now. "Not just for Mrs. T, but for everyone who walks through those doors. I've been so focused on my own struggles that I've forgotten what really matters." The murmurs of agreement from the crowd filled the space, but one voice rose above the rest. "And it starts today." The speaker was MrBeast, who had quietly re-entered the store, now accompanied by a camera crew. The sudden reappearance sent a ripple of surprise through the crowd. Phones went up again, capturing every moment. Joe blinked, startled. "You came back." MrBeast smiled faintly, gesturing to the crew behind him. "I couldn't leave just yet. I wanted to make sure you understood what an opportunity you have right here. This store could be more than just a place where people buy things, it could be a place where people feel valued." Joe looked down, nodding slowly. "I get it. I really do." MrBeast turned to the camera crew. "All right, let's make something happen." The lead cameraman stepped forward, handing MrBeast a microphone. Turning back to the crowd, MrBeast addressed them directly. "Here's the deal," he said, his tone energetic and uplifting. "Joe's store is about to get a complete makeover. New inventory, new equipment, and most importantly, a new commitment to treating every customer with respect." The crowd erupted into cheers, their earlier anger toward Joe replaced by hope and excitement. "But that's not all," MrBeast continued, his voice rising above the noise. "Mrs. Thompson, you've inspired me today. Your patience, your kindness, it's something we could all learn from. So, here's what I'm going to do for you." He turned to face her directly, his eyes full of warmth. "You're getting free groceries for life." The cheers reached a deafening pitch, and Mrs. Thompson gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Oh, my goodness," she whispered, tears spilling over once more. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," MrBeast replied with a smile. "Just keep being the amazing person you already are." The cameras panned to the crowd, capturing their smiles and teary eyes. Even Joe seemed moved, his earlier defenses completely stripped away. "Now," MrBeast said, clapping his hands together, "let's get to work." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. MrBeast's team began transforming the store in real time, unloading new shelves, restocking fresh inventory, and even adding a cozy seating area near the entrance. A professional sign company arrived to install a new marquee above the entrance, reading, "Thompson and Joe's Community Market." Mrs. Thompson protested at first, insisting that her name didn't belong there, but MrBeast wouldn't hear of it. "You're the heart of this community," he told her. "It's only right that everyone knows it." Joe worked alongside the crew, his earlier shame replaced with a genuine determination to make amends. He helped unpack boxes, clean counters, and even handed out snacks to the waiting customers. Each interaction was marked by a newfound humility, his earlier harshness nowhere in sight. By the time the sun began to set, the transformation was complete. The store was almost unrecognizable, its bright, welcoming atmosphere reflecting the fresh start it represented. As the crew wrapped up and the cameras were packed away, MrBeast gathered everyone outside for a final announcement. "Today wasn't just about fixing a store," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "It was about reminding all of us that kindness matters. That how we treat each other, whether we're strangers or neighbors, can make all the difference." The crowd erupted into applause once more, their cheers echoing down the street. Mrs. Thompson stood beside MrBeast, her eyes shining with gratitude. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible over the noise. "No, MrBeast replied, smiling down at her. Thank you for reminding us what's really important. As the crowd began to disperse, chatting excitedly about what they had witnessed, Mrs. Thompson turned to Joe. It's a fresh start for both of us, she said warmly. Joe nodded, his expression earnest. I won't let you down, Mrs. T. I promise. With the store's lights glowing brightly behind them, and the community's spirits lifted, it was clear that this day would be remembered as a turning point not just for the store, but for everyone who had been there to see it. And as MrBeast walked away into the twilight, his hoodie pulled back up over his head, he left behind a legacy of hope, generosity, and the undeniable power of kindness. The shopkeeper's jaw dropped, his eyes darting around the room, searching for support. But the crowd wasn't on his side. Murmurs of agreement rippled through them, every face now a reflection of disapproval or quiet satisfaction. You can't be serious, Joe stammered, his voice trembling. I've been running this place for years. MrBeast, his expression calm but resolute, crossed his arms. Years don't mean much if all they've been filled with is disrespect and greed. You had every chance to treat people right. Today, you showed everyone exactly who you are. Now, it's time for someone else to take over. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, her kind, wavering voice cutting through the tension. MrBeast, please, she said softly, her hands clutching the envelope he had given her. I don't want anyone to lose their livelihood. Isn't there another way? Her plea for compassion hung in the air, silencing the murmurs of the crowd. MrBeast turned to her, his expression softening. You're too good, Mrs. Thompson, he said with a small smile. But I think we can find a middle ground. He looked back at Joe, his tone firm again. You're not fired, but you're not the boss anymore. From now on, this store will be a community market, run by people who actually care about the community. You'll work under someone who can teach you what it means to be kind, fair, and respectful. Joe's face flushed with a mix of relief and humiliation. He opened his mouth to protest but closed it again, realizing he had no ground to stand on. Finally, he nodded. I understand, he muttered, his voice barely audible. MrBeast smiled faintly, then turned to Mrs. Thompson. And that person, he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear, is you. Gasps filled the store as Mrs. Thompson took a step back, shaking her head in disbelief. Me? Oh no, I couldn't possibly. You absolutely can, MrBeast interrupted gently. You're the heart of this community. People trust you, and they look up to you. Besides, he added with a wink, you'll have a whole team to help you out. Including Joe, who could use a little guidance. The crowd erupted into cheers, clapping, and whistling as Mrs. Thompson's face turned red with both surprise and gratitude. She pressed a hand to her chest, her voice trembling as she spoke. I don't know what to say. Say yes, a voice called from the crowd, followed by laughter and more applause. Mrs. Thompson chuckled through her tears, finally nodding. All right, she said, her voice steadying. If it's for the community, then yes. I'll do it. The cheers grew louder, filling the store with a renewed sense of hope and unity. The next few days were a whirlwind of transformation. True to his word, MrBeast spared no expense in turning the once dull convenience store into a vibrant, welcoming community market. The shelves were restocked with fresh produce, locally sourced goods, and even a section for free essentials for those in need. The grand opening was a celebration unlike anything the town had ever seen. Balloons decorated the entrance, and a small stage was set up outside where a local band played cheerful tunes. Families and neighbors gathered, chatting and laughing as they waited to see the new store. Mrs. Thompson stood at the entrance, greeting every customer with a warm smile. She now wore a simple yet elegant name tag that read, Mrs. Thompson, Store Manager. Joe was there too, dressed in a clean uniform and working diligently. He had taken the second chance seriously, treating every customer with the respect and kindness he had once lacked. Though it was a humbling experience for him, it was also a chance to grow. As the ribbon-cutting ceremony began, MrBeast took the microphone, his voice carrying over the crowd. "This isn't just about a store," he said, smiling at Mrs. Thompson. "It's about showing that kindness and community matter. It's about giving people a place where they feel welcome, respected, and valued." He turned to Joe, who looked up nervously. "And it's about second chances. Because we all make mistakes, but it's what we do afterward that really counts." The crowd cheered, clapping and hollering their agreement. Joe stepped forward, his cheeks red, and took the microphone. "I just want to say, thank you," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "To Mrs. T, for being patient with me. To MrBeast, for giving me another shot. And to all of you, for letting me prove I can do better." Applause filled the air again as Joe handed the microphone back to MrBeast, who raised his hand for silence. "And one more thing," MrBeast said, his tone playful now. "Every customer today gets their groceries for free." The crowd erupted into cheers and laughter, kids jumping up and down as parents exchanged looks of disbelief. It was the perfect ending to a story that had started with tension and injustice but had transformed into a celebration of hope, change, and kindness. Over time, the store became more than just a market, it became a hub for the community. Mrs. Thompson introduced programs to help those in need, from free meals for struggling families to weekly senior discounts. Joe continued to work hard, earning back the trust and respect of his neighbors. He often stayed late, organizing donations or helping Mrs. Thompson plan new initiatives. As for MrBeast, he returned occasionally to check in, always greeted with gratitude and excitement. But he often reminded the town that the real heroes were Mrs. Thompson and the community itself. "Kindness isn't about grand gestures," he once said during a visit. "It's about the little things we do every day to make someone else's life better. And that's what this place is all about." Mrs. Thompson couldn't have agreed more. Every evening, as she locked up the store and looked out at the quiet street, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. What had started as a difficult day had turned into a new chapter, not just for her, but for everyone around her. And in the hearts of the people, the store became a symbol of what could happen when kindness, justice, and second chances came together. As Mrs. Thompson stepped outside the store, the bright sunlight greeted her, casting long shadows on the pavement. Her heart felt light, despite the weight of the many changes that had unfolded in just a few short hours. She paused for a moment, looking around at the scene. The store, once a place filled with tension, was now a beacon of hope for the community. The applause from the crowd filled the air, a warm sound that seemed to echo with appreciation. People had gathered to witness the turning point, and now they celebrated not just a new store, but a new beginning. Mrs. Thompson smiled, her face glowing with the quiet pride of someone who had quietly endured much, and yet, had never given up on kindness. She stood tall, her silver hair catching the soft light of the late afternoon. Her hands, still holding the thick envelope MrBeast had given her, trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization of what had just happened. For years, she had been overlooked, treated as though she was invisible. But today, she had been seen. Today, her strength had not only been recognized but celebrated. The crowd parted for her as she walked, people whispering in awe, giving her space, but also offering her the warmth of their respect. Mrs. Thompson's heart swelled. It wasn't about the applause, or the attention, or the sudden fame she had never asked for. It was about the fact that the world, at least for this moment, had seen the truth of who she was. She had never needed to prove her worth. She had lived her life with grace and humility, and that had been enough. And now, the world knew her story not because she had shouted it from the rooftops, but because she had quietly lived it, every single day. As she reached the edge of the crowd, She looked up. MrBeast stood there, watching her, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. He had played a huge role in this transformation, but it was clear to anyone who was paying attention that he wasn't seeking recognition. No, his mission had been simple, to remind people of their inherent worth, their potential to change, and their ability to make a difference. "Thank you," Mrs. Thompson said softly, her voice carrying just enough for him to hear. MrBeast nodded, but instead of replying immediately, he looked out at the crowd. His eyes swept across the faces, some still filled with joy, others thoughtful. And in that moment, it was as if he was seeing beyond the surface. He wasn't just looking at the crowd. He was seeing the story behind each face, the lives they led, the struggles they had faced, and the strength they had carried through it all. "Sometimes," MrBeast began, raising his voice just enough for those around him to hear, "the world doesn't give us the recognition we deserve. People will overlook you. They'll judge you based on appearances, on what they assume about you, without ever really knowing your story. But the truth is, those moments when no one is looking, when no one is watching, that's when your true character shines through." He paused, letting the words sink in, before continuing. "It's not about the applause. It's not about the accolades. It's about who you are when no one else is around to see it. It's about what you do when no one is watching, when you have the chance to walk away, or to do what's easy, but you choose to do what's right instead." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had happened that day. And they weren't just for Mrs. Thompson. They were for everyone who had ever felt invisible, who had been dismissed, who had been made to feel small. They were for the people who lived quiet lives of service, kindness, and resilience, never asking for anything in return. "Don't let anyone tell you who you are. You define yourself," MrBeast said, his voice steady, with a conviction that made everyone listening stop and think. "Because when you act with kindness, when you do the right thing, even when no one is watching, that's when you become who you were always meant to be. And that's the most important thing." The crowd, once caught up in the excitement, fell into a respectful silence. The energy shifted, from celebratory to reflective. People were thinking not just about what they had witnessed today, but about their own lives, about their own choices. They were reminded that every action, every decision, no matter how small, had the power to shape their future, and the world around them. Mrs. Thompson turned, looking around at the faces of the crowd once more. And this time, she saw them differently. She didn't need to be anyone other than herself. She didn't need to prove anything. She had spent her life showing kindness and grace, and now the world was finally taking notice. Her heart swelled with pride, not for the store, not for the title she had earned, but for the truth that had finally come to light. She had never asked for more than to be treated with respect, and now, in a way she had never imagined, she had been given that respect in abundance. As she took one last look at MrBeast, their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that exchange, something unspoken passed between them. It was gratitude. It was understanding. And above all, it was the knowledge that sometimes, all it takes to change the world is for one person to stand up, to act with kindness, and to show others that they, too, are worthy of dignity and respect. With a deep breath, Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, leading the way into the store. But this time, it wasn't just her. It was everyone. They were all part of this moment, part of this new beginning. And as they walked through the doors, the sound of their footsteps was filled with purpose. Because today wasn't just about a store. It wasn't about a famous philanthropist or a shopkeeper who had been exposed. It was about something far bigger. It was about the realization that every person matters, that every action counts, even when no one else is watching. And that's what would change the world. And so, as the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the town, everyone knew, this was just the beginning. The world had seen the strength of Mrs. Thompson. and through her, it had learned the power of kindness, respect, and the quiet courage of those who act when no one is looking. It was the beginning of a new era, one where every person could stand tall, knowing that who they were in the dark was the same as who they were in the light. And that was enough. Sometimes, the quietest people are the ones who make the most lasting impact. And those who treat others with kindness, they are the ones who leave the biggest legacy.